Good evening, my holy brothers and sisters. Going a little bit on the late side today. Checking out to see if that might work better for some people. We're varying up the times, see how it goes. Got a great page for you tonight. And a very important ruling that we all make use of all the time. It's wonderful. And a great story that involves what happens when you earn the ire, the anger of a sage. Terrifying result. Let us light up the darkness. And perhaps you will comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. We always want to know. Your comments, reactions, signal to Facebook. We are lighting up the darkness and doing something of value here on Facebook. Cindy Gray says hello. Jody Stancliffe is in from Fort Mitchell, Kentucky. Great to see you, Jody. Who else is in the house? Who else is with us? I think there's election returns coming in tonight. You can get back to that in a little while. Tonight's show should not be too long. I'm just going to tell you this wonderful story and the rulings that come out of it. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Very true. Never anger a good-hearted sage, says Jage. Carolyn is in from Raleigh, North Carolina. Robin from Alabama. James is in Indianapolis. Great to see you. You know, this camera acts like a mirror, but it's backwards for me, so I can never center my hat. All right, Debbie is in from Michigan. Cheryl from Kansas. Ivan from Las Vegas. Wonderful to see you. Cheryl also from Indy. All right. So, in today's daf, recall, we are in volume 1 of the Talmud. Excuse me. Berachos, blessings. And we're in chapter 6. We're actually literally studying blessings. Which blessings to make? When do we make them? How do we make them? And when we have a choice, when we're eating 2 foods and it's unclear which blessing we should make, so that's the subject of what we're studying these last few days, and particularly tonight, when it leads to an incident. So here we go. We'll understand some of these rules as we study the incident. So the great sage, Bar Kapara, was sitting with 2 students, and he gave permission to one of the students to make the blessing over their food. What were they eating? Cooked vegetable, in this case cabbage, and there were also some Syrian plums, Damascene plums, which apparently was not actually a fruit. It's called a plum, but it's a particular kind of object that's really a vegetable. And that's why the rules for eating an actual fruit don't come into this. Possibly because it was a cooked fruit, but more likely because it's a vegetable. More importantly, the primary vegetable in this meal was cabbage, cooked cabbage, along with poultry, in this case a pullet, which is a type of hen. For our purposes, just imagine this is chicken. So let's say that you're eating a meal and it's just going to be chicken and cooked vegetables, right? Now, ideally, if we were having such a meal, we would have some bread with it. Even if we didn't really need the bread along with the meal, we're not the type of people who like to eat bread with chicken and vegetables. It would be better if we had some bread, because then the blessing, the bracha, would be 100% clear, right? We would wash our hands. We would say a blessing over washing our hands. Then we would make a blessing over the bread. The bread would exempt the rest of the food. It would be covered. We would need to make blessings over the other foods that we eat at that meal. And after finishing the meal, we would recite the grace after the meal, the Birkat Hamazon. That's the ideal situation. But it doesn't always happen that way. So sometimes we eat a meal without bread. Technically, ritually, Talmudically speaking, such a meal has the status of a snack. It's like an elevated snack, right? If that meal included wine, so that would be good. We could make a blessing over the wine because wine is significant. Or perhaps if we had some crackers handy, we could make the Borei Minei Mizonos blessing, a blessing over the types of nourishment, because grains are actually more significant than meat. It's quite interesting, right? Why? Because grains are one of the 7 species that the Torah uses to characterize the beauty and abundance of the Holy Land. Let's say there's no crackers, right? No form of grain product along with this meal. Okay, so then we have this sort of ladder of specificity, right? Where bread is at the top, then wine, then fruit of a tree, then fruit of the ground, which is vegetables. And then finally, we have a catch-all blessing for foods that don't fit into any of these categories, which is shehakol, meaning when we say a blessing, like when I make a l'chaim on the show, and I say, by blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. But that is a catch-all blessing, and that is not preferable. It is preferable to eat a food over which we can make a specific blessing. And I just actually was talking about this tonight as I was leaving shul with my good friend, Rabbi Yekusiel Kalmanson, and he said, well, why should we make a blessing over something more specific, rather than less specific? And he says, imagine that you cook a dinner for your friends, right? And let's say you make a nice chicken with vegetables. And afterwards they say, oh, that was great. Great meal. It was awesome. Or let's say they said, that was a delicious roast chicken. I loved how savory it was, how the herbs really brought out the flavor, etc. Right? That more specific compliment would mean more to you as the maker of the meal, right? And since when we're making blessings, we're saying that all of our food comes from the Holy One. And since the food comes, right, we cook it, we add to it, but the food that comes out of the ground or comes off a tree, or that's eventually made into bread, which is the most significant of all. So when we can be more specific that way, so it's a better compliment to God. Okay, back to Bar Kapara. That he and his two students were eating, right, let's say chicken, and it was a type of hen, but let's just call it chicken for now. Chicken and boiled cabbage, right, cooked vegetable. So the question is, it's not so simple, it's a little bit tricky. Which should be the blessing be? There's no bread, and there's no grain product, and there's no wine. The two significant foods here are the chicken and the vegetable. Now, somebody's instinct might be, well, the chicken is more significant, right? The meat is more important than the side dish, right, which is the cooked vegetable. And so the student who was given permission to make the blessing, that's what he did. He made a blessing over the chicken. He said, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. And then he ate some of the chicken. And it actually says he hurried and recited the blessing and ate of the chicken. And the other student who was there at the meal ridiculed the first student, saying that he was a glutton, right? That because he was in a hurry to eat the chicken, he didn't do the right thing and make a blessing over the cooked vegetable first. Bar Kapara glares at both of them and says, I am not angry with the one who made the wrong blessing, but rather the one who ridiculed him. Because perhaps for him, he's never had chicken before, and this is a very significant and important day in his life, and he had a good cause to go for the chicken first. So then he looks at the one who made the mistaken blessing and says, and I am not angry with the one who ridiculed, but I am angry with the one who made the wrong blessing, because is there no wisdom here? Do we not have an elder who could have been consulted when it was a questionable situation? Right? He was angry that the one who made the blessing and rushed into it didn't ask his teacher with whom he's sitting what's the right thing. The fact that he hurried indicates that he wasn't sure and he just kind of went for it. Why didn't he ask his teacher? Right? We put a big premium on getting the counsel from our elders, particularly in Torah matters, right? In matters of law and ritual practice. Here he had the opportunity to get the teaching, right? Everything that, we don't just learn it from books. It's very important, especially at the time of the sages when these guys were teaching, was the oral tradition, hadn't been written down yet at all. Everything was passed down. And the learning was not just, hearing the master say what the laws are, but also observing how the master would handle the situation. Now here they were given permission to make the blessing. It was almost like the master was testing them. Since he wasn't sure, that would have been the perfect time to ask the master how to handle this. Excuse me, there we go. So, the next thing we're told is that because the master was so angry with them, let me get the exact quote here, and the Gemara concludes that it was taught, and both of them, the students, did not live out his year. Due to Bar Kapara's anger, they were punished by heaven, and both died within the year. Right? And we see this at other places in the Talmud. I mean, we can't be so sure, why they died, but the fact is they died. They died within a year. And maybe it was a plague, maybe it was, just lack of medicine at 2,000 years ago. Medicine wasn't what it is today. People died much more often than people will die today. But we'll see this idea come up repeatedly in the Talmud, that if you anger a sage, somebody who's basically a saint, right, who's dedicated his whole life to elucidating and illuminating and revealing God's word to the people, you do so at your peril. And these poor students, it's not that Bar Kapara, cursed them or wanted them to die, not remotely. But when you anger a sage, you put yourself at risk. And if you're living in a time and place, when food and medicine are already precarious, you don't want to diminish your chances of survival in any way. So, what's a takeaway from that story? Now, the right thing to do, because we have a specific bracha, specific blessing for vegetables, and we do not have a specific blessing for meat. Though meat seems more significant, it is not, because meat is covered by the catch-all blessing by whose word everything comes into being. So rather, when we have just those two as the choice, the meat and the vegetable, we make a blessing over the vegetable. And of course, having made the blessing over the vegetable, we eat the vegetable first. And then we move on to the meat, right? When you have an opportunity to make a specific blessing, you do that, right? And it's just like Rabbi Kalmanson said, when you give a compliment to the creator of something, it's beautiful to be specific as possible. And that is the reasoning why we make a blessing over the food with a specific blessing in preference over the one with the general blessing. Now, what if we have two foods that both have specific blessings? For example, if you were going to eat a piece of fruit and a vegetable in the same meal, so now you would actually bless the fruit first. Even though it seems like fruit is dessert, vegetable is, more the main course, but fruit of the tree, which is the blessing for fruit, as we call it fruit, is a more specific blessing than fruit of the ground. Ground is just more general, tree more specific. But the preferred order is, when unsure, get a piece of bread, make a blessing over the bread, and do it that way. If you don't have bread available, hopefully you have a grain product. And that's why very often, at the Kiddush, after Saturday morning services, if they're serving some food, there will be some crackers or some cake there, so that you can make the mizonos blessing, right? The types of nourishment, meaning the grain product, because that is a higher form. It gets a more specific and higher blessing than for fruit of the tree or fruit of the ground, than for fruits or vegetables. And particularly because if you make the mizonos blessing, the types of nourishment, so after the meal is over, now you have a longer after blessing, right? When you eat bread, you have a very long blessing after the meal. That's the entire grace after meals, the Birkat HaMazon. When you would just eat a grain product, so then you have the abridged but still three-part blessing after the meal. If you only ate meat, for example, and meat and vegetables, then the after blessing is the shortest one of all, the Borei Nefashos, who makes all the types of life and their needs, right? But that's a very short blessing. So it's preferable to eat something that results in a longer blessing. And so, I studied this earlier today, and then I was thinking, okay, for example, on Shabbat day, so Friday night we have, the very elaborate meal that you may be familiar with, the Shabbat dinner. On Saturday, it's very common to eat cholent. Right? Cholent is a very typical Jewish food for Shabbat. It's a food that kind of cooks all through Shabbat on its own, and it's nice and hot when you eat it Saturday afternoon. Right? Now, normally we would have challah at lunch on Saturday, but sometimes you have a snack later in the day of some of that cholent that's still sitting around. Or you have some leftover cholent and maybe you're going to eat it on Sunday night, right? And so now if you're eating that cholent without the crackers, without the challah, so what is the blessing going to be on cholent by itself? And of course that depends on what's in the cholent, right? Very often, so cholent is sort of like a meat stew. It's a very homey, rich meat stew. Very often it has barley in it, right? So if the cholent has barley in it, now it has one of those 2 grains that are part of the 7 species that characterize the Holy Land. So now you would make a mizonos blessing before the cholent and the almichya, the 3-part after blessing, after you've eaten it. But if it's more of a Persian stew, a Persian cholent, so it might feature meat and potatoes and lentils with a bunch of beautiful savory spices. Nina makes a fantastic cholent. But not necessarily with barley in it. So now there's no grain product in it. Now you have a cholent that is meat and vegetables, right? Just meat and potato and lentils. So now you would say, Borei Pri Hadama. You'd be blessing the vegetable in this meat stew, right? Because the vegetable blessing is more specific than the shehakol, the catch-all blessing that you might make on that you might make on the meat. Okay, so hopefully that is clear. And it is a somewhat tricky situation, right? Even today, this is the kind of question that will lead to people making a discussion on, well, it depends, and what is the percentages and what's really in it, and has the vegetable changed its state? But the rules are basically as I've just laid them out for you. Right, and then finally on this page 39, here in Berachos, in chapter 6 of Tractate Berachos, we also have, this is the home address, right, for the teaching that we get from Rabbi Abba, which is when we make our Friday night dinner, and we make a kiddush, right, we make a blessing over the wine. And even though bread is more significant than wine, so normally we would bless the bread first because it's on the table, but because we make a kiddush to sanctify that we're moving into the Sabbath, right? So we make the kiddush first on the wine, but because the bread is more significant and normally gets its blessing first, we cover the bread, right? That's not what's explained here. What's explained here is that what's under that cover is not 1 loaf of bread, but 2. Here on page 39, 39b of Berachos, we have the home address for the teaching, the mitzvah, the commandment, that when we bless the bread on Shabbat, we do it over 2 loaves, per the opinion of Rabbi Abba. Why 2 loaves? Because it recalls when the children of Israel were in the desert and we're eating what for 40 years? What did we eat for 40 years when we were in the desert? Manna, right? The manna from heaven, which is essentially a type of bread, a type of nourishment that we found on the ground, lying on top of a layer of dew, then the manna, and then another layer of dew on top of that. And that was our sustenance, our primary sustenance for all those years. And because one is not allowed to do work on the Sabbath, on Saturday, we would gather the manna every morning, but on Friday mornings we would gather a double portion. And the 2 loaves of challah, the 2 loaves of bread on the Friday night Shabbos table represent that double portion of manna which we gathered in the desert on Friday so that we would not have to gather on Saturday. Any other day of the week, if people gathered more manna than they needed and tried to keep it over until the next day, it would rot and become all maggoty. That was last week's Torah portion. But if they gathered on Friday, they would just get a double portion and it would remain fresh and beautiful tasting and taste like fried dough with honey, both on Friday and on Saturday. That's why we have 2 loaves of challah on the table. Okay, that is our teaching for tonight. Let me check some of these comments. Just bring the screen a little closer to me. I just want to see if there's any questions. It's great to see you all here. Lindsay and Lori and Michael from Arizona and Randy from Florida and Lindsay from Ohio and Dubrovka from Chicago and Iris from Brooklyn. And Atara Kennedy says, how did it come about between the two since both are shehakol? What was shehakol? The boiled vegetables is adamah, right? The boiled cabbage is adamah, the blessing over the vegetable. So you could clarify your question. Let me know what you're thinking there. Jean says hi from Nebraska. Ron says, Ron from Salt Lake City is with you live this evening. Great to have you here, Ron. Cheryl Goldman is in the house. Marta from Brazil. It's so cool that we have such an international audience. And Ellen from Central Florida. It's so great to have you all here. All right, so I am... Oh, and Dubravka says you pronounced my name just right. I'm so glad. Thank you for letting me know that. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions. Just going to double check one more time. And Nancy from Florida and Martin from Minnesota. Okay, my pals, wishing you all the best. Our takeaway from tonight is to remember this idea that when we're confronted with 2 foods, if one, the normal blessing for it is the catch-all blessing, shehakol, and the other has the more specific blessing. So we would eat the food with the more specific blessing first so that we could give that more specific compliment to the Creator. And generally speaking, it's a good teaching for us to learn, right? Everybody loves a compliment. Abraham Lincoln said that. And when we give compliments, let us be specific with our compliments, because everybody loves a compliment and everybody loves a specific compliment even more. Wishing you all the best and sending big love from LA.